One of the best things about World of Warcraft is that we are going to be returning to Northrend soon. The Wrath of Lich King expansion is one of my favorite eras of any game ever, and Northrend as a whole not only holds an immense amount of nostalgia for me, but is legitimately a place that I enjoyed playing through a lot. With the future The Last Titan expansion, we are going to be returning to Northrend once again in a very similar fashion to how we will soon be returning to Quel'Thalas in the Midnight expansion. Players who quested and raided in the Wrath of Lich King will definitely remember certain moments from their time on this continent, from fighting back certain enemy factions to defeating incredibly important bosses to building up entire outposts. Northrend changed a lot in our short time there, but it has also changed a lot in the years since we have left. Today, I want to go across the continent and speculate about how everything will be different when we return to Northrend once again. So let's get started. Very briefly, I wanted to highlight geography. We can see the entirety of Northrend from the Wrath of Lich King expansion, an expansion that released in 2008, with the graphics and technical ability of its time. Returning to this continent in 2028, or whatever year it will be, roughly 20 years of advancement later, we can expect Northrend on the baseline to look in theme similar to how it looks in 2008, but updated to look similar to places like Kazagar, which we got with the War Within expansion. So if you're someone who likes the theme of Wrath of Lich King, but the graphics of the War Within, you should be in for a treat. I expect that the general scale of Northrend might be slightly bigger to account for this, with maybe taller mountains in the Storm Peaks and wider tundras in the Borean Tundra. I am sure that the Titan facility of Ogier, which is more than just the Ogier raid itself and is pretty much everything Titan related across Northrend, will be much more dramatic and fleshed out, given the fact that this expansion will likely be focusing more on a Titan storyline than it will on an undead storyline like we saw in Wrath of Lich King. There is also the thought that we could see the Cataclysm have an impact on Northrend like how it had a massive impact on Kalimdor and the Eastern Kingdoms, though I would say this is probably unlikely, but maybe some stuff happened, like the Forgotten Shore was washed away and some sort of tsunami or something. Lastly, and the thing that World of Warcraft developers love more than anything, islands. We could realistically see just random new islands added right off the coast of Northrend that play a part in the expansion. We see the Isle of Conquest, Strand of the Ancients, and Hrothgar's Landing as examples from the original Wrath of Lich King, and we could realistically see anything added in for whatever reason. Next, let's talk about the major factions. First are the Alliance and the Horde. We see that these two factions built up a ton of outposts across Northrend in the war against the Scourge, and we helped out all these places throughout our adventures in Wrath of Lich King, but most of these bases were primarily military bases with the main purpose of defeating the Lich King. And we know that once the events of Wrath of Lich King was over, the majority of Alliance and Horde forces left Northrend, leaving only, you could say, skeleton crews behind to keep some presence on the continent. So when we return, we could see some of the bases that did exist during Wrath of Lich King are just straight up no longer there. The Westfall Brigade encampment is a perfect example of this type of base that is now probably just an empty field in the Grizzly Hills. Likewise, when the Alliance and Horde return to Northrend again, we could see a resurgence in some of these old bases or brand new bases altogether. The biggest Alliance and Horde bases in the Borean Tundra and Howling Fjord are very likely to still be pretty major bases in The Last Titan, given the fact that they were massive in Wrath of Lich King and still had a fair few soldiers left in them, specifically since the end of the Wrath of Lich King. There are also the idea of Horde and Alliance settlers, especially in the Howling Fjord and the Grizzly Hills area. Fort Weldervar, or however you pronounce it, in the Howling Fjord is a good example of an area where a lot of humans were trying to settle, build new homes, and start a new life. So we could see these areas built up a lot in the last 20 years, or potentially wiped out or abandoned. To that extent, we could also see groups like the Hunters in Grizzly Hills still have a presence, and maybe even working with the Alliance more. Maybe there are survivors from the Worgen Curse who have been able to rebuild their settlements, or maybe they even embraced the Worgen Curse similar to the Ghanaians and are now on good terms with the Alliance. Similar to that, we see a bunch of other smaller factions connected to both the Horde and Alliance. The Tonka allied themselves with the Horde and have settlements all across Northrend. Some of these settlements have probably moved to new locations, as that is what the Tonka did. Some may be in new places, there may be new groups altogether, and maybe some went away as many Tonka left for Kalimdor and the rest of Azeroth with their newfound Horde allies. You also got the Frostborn from the Storm Peaks, who may play a bigger part in an expansion focused on the Titans. A lot of people joke that we may see them even be an allied race for the Alliance, adding yet another dwarf to the roster, or maybe we'll see the Tonka become an allied race for the Horde. We then have the Undead Scourge, the main forces we fought throughout Wrath Lich King, and we killed a lot of Scourge in our time in Northrend, but after having killed Arthas, there were still a ton of Scourge left, and Bolvar 4 Dragon took the Helm of Domination to control the Scourge from running rampant across Azeroth. Now that the Helm of Domination was destroyed or whatever happened in Shadowlands, the Scourge, to the best of my understanding, are running rampant across Northrend. We could see one extreme where the entire continent is controlled by the Scourge, and most of all life is completely wiped out. We're coming into Northrend, we have to clear through massive hordes of uncontrollable Scourge in order to access places like Ogiar, which will be important for the main story. I'm sure a lot of people would like this, but I think it would make the modern version Northrend pretty boring. Having something more complex where there are still a lot of different outposts that are still stable and standing would be much better than just a waste of nothingness. It is likely we will see some major Scourge leaders arise to try to take control of parts of the Scourge for their own goals and claims to power. Maybe some powerful undead that we have seen before, but also some other undead that we will be meeting for the first time. With however the story goes, it is basically confirmed that we will be dealing with the Scourge to some extent, and likely a larger extent than nothing at all. But then we also have the Knights of the Ebon Blade, who were the largest organization and force left behind on Northrend, who basically decided to keep watch over the undead and make sure that Bolvar is actually able to keep the Scourge generally controlled. Then we see the scary expansion known as Shadowlands rise up again, where the Knights of the Ebon Blade played a pretty big part in that expansion, and as a result, a lot of their forces left Northrend and were eventually killed. But they still exist in Northrend, and many forces likely returned after the events of Shadowlands. With the Scourge being unleashed on Northrend because of what happened to the Helm of Domination, it is likely that we will see a story where the Ebon Blade have suffered some massive defeats and may be hanging onto a thread by the time we arrive in Northrend to help out. Where if that thread breaks, maybe the Scourge can be unleashed onto the rest of Azeroth, and most of the knights recognize the importance of what they are doing in Northrend, more so now than ever before. We know the Argent Crusade still have a presence on Northrend, mostly around the Argent Vanguard, but still with some forces at the Argent Tournament Grounds and elsewhere. We can easily expect that some other factions like the Sons of Holdir, the Oracles, the Frenzy Heart Tribe, and the Kalyak are still present on the continent to varying degrees. Then we see the Scarlet Onslaught / Scarlet Crusade, who have supposedly been completely wiped out like 6 times, so they are likely going to have a major presence on the continent and may even be the main villains of the expansion. But now, let's quickly go zone by zone and highlight some of the last major changes that we will see. Every zone is going to be influenced by the changes in geography and map design that we see come with the Last Titan expansion. Alongside that, depending on what happens to each of the factions, is going to really change up some of the big parts of each zone. Starting with the Borean Tundra, I feel like we could maybe even see a larger Alliance and Horde presence in this map than before, especially with the Alliance potentially building up a large town and multiple farm areas surrounding Valiant's Keep. I could also see this map focusing a lot less on undead. Maybe they have been pushed back by the Alliance and Horde into Dragonblight and Icecrown. In the Undead's place, we could see a lot more storylines focused around the Titans, originating from the Geyser Fields, and maybe even a new Titan facility that was unearthed. Briefly highlighting Wintergrasp, I doubt this will be a big PvP area, but maybe it will be, but it is likely to play a big part in the expansion story, with the Vault of Archivon being a big moment in the expansion's questing story, where I could actually see Wintergrasp being combined with the Borean Tundra to make a larger zone that is more in line with the modern zones that we see in modern day World of Warcraft. Alongside this, we could even see Wintergrasp and the Vault of Archivon become the main player hub in the expansion. So an overarching storyline we could see is the Alliance and Horde returning to their outposts, learning about whatever Titan or other threat is happening here, and then we fight back against whatever threat into the Vault of Archivon, where the map story is concluded. Outside of the major stuff, we will likely see some dragon stories going on, especially related to the Blue Dragon Flight in Kodara, where we may see Kalecgos' story expanded on once again. Then another minor story beat may be related to the Riplash Ruins, where we see some sort of smaller elf storyline in this area coming after the events of all the elf storylines in Midnight. Next, let's move up to Sholazar Basin. This is a very interesting zone because it had 3 distinct storylines, with the Oracles and Frenzy Heart Tribes feud, alongside the Hemet Nestingware storyline, alongside a smaller storyline related to the Titans and Keepers. I feel like this zone could go one of 2 ways. The first way would be basically copy and pasting this zone from Wrath Lich King and making it kind of a silly area of the expansion with a bunch of random fun stuff in it, like another hunting story, but maybe with some different things added in. We could also see this zone dramatically expanded to highlight more of the Titan storyline that will be going on in the expansion, and may even serve as a central area for a lot of the story, where we go to different Titan facilities all across Azeroth as we progress through the expansion. But a different storyline that could also happen is how Sholazar Basin could be combined with Icecrown, similar to what I thought about maybe happening between the Borean Tundra and Wintergrass. This would make the zone feel more aligned with modern day zones, but could also connect these two areas into one overarching storyline. A big thing we saw with the original Sholazar was how the Scourge were pouring into the zone and we had to stop it. But maybe with all the shenanigans that has happened with the Scourge, we see that they completely took over Sholazar and it now looks nothing like it did in the original Wrath Lich King. We could start adventuring in Sholazar after the Borean Tundra, and then we work our way through the basin and then into Icecrown proper, highlighting all of the massive undead storylines that we would have in The Last Titan, where we fight back against the different leaders trying to take control of the Scourge, help save the Ebon Blade, and maybe even the Argent Crusade, and help bring stability to the Scourge somehow. There could also be some Titan stories connected to this, when we are first exploring Sholazar, and maybe we learn that Eridikron has somehow influenced the Scourge in some way to stall the Horde, Alliance, and other factions from getting closer to Odior, and this is where we learn about that. This could also be a good zone to add a bigger war-themed story since we are playing in the world of Warcraft, where Icecrown during Wrath Lich King was basically a massive war zone with big airships, a bunch of planes, and a ton of troops all across the zone, and we could see a modern take on that with some potential for insane cinematics on top of that. This also allows us some time to highlight what has happened to the Ebon Blade following Shadowlands, and maybe what role they will play in the future. This lets us hang out with the Argent Crusade some more, since while we have gotten a little story, the last time there was a big focus on this organization was all the way back in the Legion expansion. Moving down to Dragonblight, this zone is definitely going to be a super important part of this expansion. This area is super important for the different Dragonflights, and after all of the stories we saw during the Dragonflight expansion itself, we could definitely see a lot of new developments in this zone, where I feel like there may not be a major Horde or Alliance presence in the zone, and we're definitely going to focus on highlighting the stories of the Dragonflights. This could be seen with all the different shrines, and maybe we'll even visit new sanctums as a part of dungeons or raids. But I feel like this allows an opportunity to be a midpoint of the expansion where we are introduced to modern day Northrend in the earlier zones I talked about, then we experience a massive defeat that sets the stakes for the expansion, that then takes us into the next zones as we approach the ending. A lot of people speculate that Eridikron will play a major part in this expansion, as he may be one of the final bosses of The Last Titan, where we could start learning about what he has been doing in Icecrown, Sholazar, and the Borean Tundra, and then we see him for the first time here in Dragonblight, where he appears and just kills a bunch of people or destroys Wormrest Temple or something. There's a lot of potential for a lot of different stories. On top of all that, we could see Wormrest Temple acting as the major hub in this expansion, which is what a lot of people speculated about. I feel like there would have to be a lot of changes to the overall structure of the temple itself, and it feels like a place that wouldn't necessarily ever be purposed for a hub, given its importance to the overarching reason Dragonblight is what it is. We then also have Crystalsog Forest, which is maybe the most random zone from the Wrath Lich King expansion, and was there to hold Delaran as a player hub. Given what has happened to Delaran, I don't think we'll see it here in The Last Titan, but maybe it will be back, where we could potentially see Crystalsog Forest build up into a major hub for the players by the dragons or the various factions of the world. But I feel like this would just be an area that is now connected to Dragonblight that provides an opportunity for players to progress the story going on in Dragonblight with the different dragon and titan storylines we got going on. We could also maybe see some elven storylines going on here similar to Replash Ruins that expand upon the story we will have just experienced in Midnight. On the eastern side of the continent we have 3 zones that are Howling Fjord, the Grizzly Hills, and Zuldrak. And I feel like these zones are outliers for the Last Titan expansion, where there isn't too much opportunity currently present in the map to help support the overarching story. Howling Fjord does have a bunch of Titan stuff going on, and maybe they will really dive deep into this and reveal a bunch of facilities in this zone that we are going to be exploring. Howling Fjord as a whole could also be a really good opportunity to highlight a lot of different groups that we left in the Wrath Lich King, like the Human Settlers, or the Kalyak, or the Vrykul. Maybe Howling Fjord would be more of a laid-back zone without too much going on that provides a break for players in the expansion to mess around with fun storylines that really highlight certain groups of people. Maybe Howling Fjord will be more directed towards newer players, where this could be a place that allows new players to learn a lot about how to play World of Warcraft before beginning the rest of the expansion. Maybe we will have the main hub of the expansion located here, where we have big alliance and horde outposts that could be expanded. And really, there's a lot of stuff that could be going on in this zone, but I think we can all agree that it will be absolutely gorgeous. One potential we could see is that the Howling Fjord will lead into the Grizzly Hills as well, where these two zones could be connected together into one. Though I can also see the Grizzly Hills and Zuodrack being connected into two zones as well, or maybe all three of these zones could be connected into one massive zone that doesn't have too much main story stuff going on, but features an absolutely staggering amount of side stories that highlight so many different parts of Northrend and the World of Warcraft story. We know that the Drakari Empire has completely collapsed and that the Ebon Blade are really struggling with the Scourge in this area, where maybe we progress through all three of these areas and eventually begin to fight the Scourge, which then takes us to Sholazar and Icecrown. We will also likely see a lot of troll storylines where we learn more about the Drakari Empire and see various different imported trolls playing a part in us exploring this area. I think these three zones could also be the perfect locations for another expedition faction that are exploring Northrend and whatnot, especially with the Harrison Jones stories that happened in the original Grizzly Hills. We could also see some Night Elf storylines going on with the Warder Cell, and maybe that could even be a big hub for the expansion. We could see a repeat of the Wrath Lich King expansion where players can choose to begin in either the Howling Fjord or the Boring Tundra, and then all players are united for Sholazar and Icecrown into Dragonblight, and then eventually into the Storm Peaks for the ending of the expansion storylines. Storm Peaks is the most obvious zone to be the final area of the Last Titan's base expansion, where we will most likely get a couple of post-release zones after it releases, like with Siren Isle, Undermine, and Crash in The War Within. A lot of players think OGR will be the main player hub for the expansion, which could be the case, and we could also see the player hub located somewhere else in the Storm Peaks. But if Eridikron is playing a major role in this expansion, we could see that he set up shop inside of OGR, where OGR will serve as the main raid at the start of the War Within expansion, and be one of the most important parts of the entire story of the World Soul Saga. We also know that Yogg-Saron is still having an impact on the world from inside of OGR, and we could have a ton of storylines connected to him, who could also have storylines going on elsewhere in Northrend, like in the Howling Fjord. This is also the biggest opportunity to involve Xal'atath in the story, where she can have a lot going on with Yogg-Saron and everything connected to the two of them, assuming Xal'atath isn't defeated at the end of the Midnight expansion. But with the Pantheon's return to Azeroth and the whole uncovering an ancient conspiracy that stretches throughout the entire history of Azeroth thing that we have learned about with the Last Titan, the most likely place for us to learn all of this and interact with all of this is in the Storm Peaks, where we can learn tidbits here and there throughout all the other zones, but the Storm Peaks would definitely be the culmination and conclusion of all the big stories happening at the release of The Last Titan. Now, when we look at the continent as a whole after everything we talked about, there really is a lot of stuff that could potentially happen and a lot of different directions that the story could go beyond what I have talked about. But the map on your screen is a general summary of what I think we could potentially see with the questing experience in The Last Titan. And those are all my general thoughts. There's a lot that could happen to this continent, and we will only ever truly know once we begin exploring Northrend again in The Last Titan. I love thinking about and speculating about stuff like this, so please leave a comment down below with what you think will be happening. Some players may think some of the potential things I speculated about may be stupid, but I love thinking about every potential direction that the story could go and how this continent could change. I hope you all are taking great care of yourselves. Have a good one, everyone.